IVM.
How would you like to be rewarded for paying your credit card bills on time? Cred gives you the chance to be part of an exclusive club of highly trustworthy individuals where you get cashback and other rewards for being good. Now that's a great policy. So don't miss out. Just download Cred and be part of the club.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. We have a special episode lined up for you today about a topic that not a lot of people generally talk about in modern India. And that is India's local legends, or as they're also known, folk tales, and specifically folk tales from southern India. As we'll see through this episode, the folk tales or the local legends of southern India tell us a great deal about the complex relationships that various religious and caste groups have had in southern India over many, many centuries. And we're going to explain this by going through a whole bunch of fascinating examples from Mallanna, a fascinating god from Telangana, where I'm from, and wrapping up with the Catholic saints of Tamil Nadu, who have some very interesting, almost sibling-like relationships with various deities that we might consider Hindu. So without any further ado, let me welcome my guest for today's podcast, Vivek Joseph. Vivek, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on All Things Policy.
Thank you for having me.
So Vivek is an independent researcher who does a lot of work on actually documenting local legends and practices, specifically in southern India, mostly in Telangana, and also he does a little bit of work on Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So we're going to have a whole bunch of interesting questions for you, Vivek, and hopefully kind of unravel a little bit of this fascinating tapestry of stories that we've inherited as Indians today. Without any further ado, let's actually get into the discussion. Just before we started recording this podcast, Vivek, we had a little bit of a chat about what exactly do we call these stories and these legends, right? So in general, they're very often thought of as folk tales. There's a beautiful volume by A.K. Ramanujan called Folk Tales of India, which I've recently got my hands on. But the term folk tales is kind of misleading in some ways, I think you pointed out. So can you tell us a little bit more about what the term folk tales kind of implies, and a better way perhaps to kind of frame these stories that are so prevalent at the local level but don't very often get the kind of attention that more well-known mainstream myths do?
Sure. So essentially, the trouble with how we perceive folk tales and folk traditions they come from in India it's a bit problematic. In a pure academic sense of it, folk religion, folk deities, etc., refer to practices and beings that are directly accessible to local populations. So you don't essentially have a deity or a belief system that is quite out of reach to your average worshipper, but rather it enables direct interaction, direct conversations with the divine. But when we translate the term folk religion or folk deity into common parlance, and this is also something that you see a lot in Indian academia, there arises a sense of hierarchy, because essentially the word folk implies that there is a tradition or there are a set of beings that are greater than the deities and the practices of popular religion in India. And a lot of anthropologists who study religion in the subcontinent, particularly in relation to Hinduism, tend to cite there being two sets of traditions. So you have a greater Brahminical Hindu tradition that is dominated by a Sanskrit literary canon, but you also have so-called lesser traditions. And again, you do see a bit of a problem there, because these lesser traditions are where these so-called folk tales and folk deities and folk practices emerge from. And so it sort of becomes invariably a dismissive term as such in terms of how seriously these tales and these deities are to be taken. And there's also there tends to be a bit of a casteist and colonial angle to this as well, because ultimately a lot of so-called folk religion is practiced primarily by Dalit and Bahujan communities in the subcontinent. And terms such as, well, a lesser tradition or a folk tradition sort of dismisses their practices and their deities, who in many cases are extremely important to these populations in favor of, let's say, a wider, more accurate or more believable tradition per se. So when we look at, we're looking at today's syncretic traditions, and a lot of these syncretic legends come from popular religion, come from local mythologies. So I kind of tend to prefer using the term local deities and local mythologies to kind of solve that issue.
That's quite a fascinating point, and there's really a lot of history clearly behind the terms that we use to describe these legends, right? I remember reading a really interesting study that was basically about a survey that was conducted by the British in Bihar, if I remember correctly, sometime in the 1880s or so. And it was very interesting because of the way that it kind of classified religious groups. It didn't really not a lot of people were classified as Hindu really in that survey. Most of the people who responded to the survey preferred to describe themselves in ways that the British surveyors couldn't really wrap their heads around. So they just put them down as, I think, tantric worshippers or something, which is, of course, an interesting point because, of course, left-hand tantra is really integral in a lot of ways to modern Hindu practices, such as even things like repeating mantras, for example. But really, that's a discussion for a whole other day. The basic point really is that there's this idea that some traditions are more representative of an Indian religion or of the Indian religion than others is something that is a result of a particular process of making knowledge. And while there are certainly these pan-subcontinental legends, as it were, that you see kind of repeated in the political mythology of multiple states all across the subcontinent, even beyond, in some cases, in Southeast Asia as well, in practice, if you're looking at the daily lives of people in the pre-modern period, when India was primarily an agrarian/pastoralist society, most people very rarely went even more than a few hundred or dozen miles beyond where they were born. The character of local religion would have been very, very different from the way that we think about it today. And as such, folk tales, as they're called, are really not that. They're really much, much more representative of how people have thought about Indian religion for a much longer time, really. So I agree, this idea of calling them local legends and giving them their rightful place, as it were, in our understanding of what Indian religions are is something that's very important for us to do today. But with that said, let's actually get into a few examples of how these local legends, of what kind of stories these local legends actually tell us, and what they kind of hint at in terms of the historical relationships between various communities in the Indian subcontinent. I'd like to begin by asking you, Vivek, about this fascinating deity called Mallanna, also known as Mylar and Khandoba. So for context for our listeners, Mylar/Mallanna/Khandoba is essentially a god of pastoralists. In some legends, he's also a bit of a bandit god. So in a lot of ways, he's kind of outside the quote-unquote greater tradition of Indian religions as we might think. Now, what is fascinating to me about Khandoba, and also known as Mylar and Mallanna, I'm just going to call him Mallanna from now on. What is really fascinating to me about Mallanna is the fact that he's actually a fairly ancient deity who has been around for quite a few centuries, who was fairly prominent among some very important South Indian polities, such as, for example, the Vijayanagara Empire, and who continued to be a major force even during the period of the Deccan Sultanates and well beyond that into the period of the Nizam and to this present day. Now, what I'm going to ask you about, Vivek, is this fascinating story of Mallanna going to Mecca. What is the story, and what do you think it tells us about the interactions of religious communities in Telangana?
Well, this particular story comes from an Ogu Katha, and in Telangana specifically, Mallanna is primarily, as you said, primarily worshipped by pastoralist communities. And the two main pastoralist Telugu communities are the Yadava Gollas, who are cowherds, and the Kurmas, who are shepherds or goat herds. So the Yadava Gollas and the Kurmas have a set of bards, cum priests, called the Ogus, who essentially sing ballads about Mallanna as well as deities related to him, other local deities in the region. So most of these are oral traditions. It's very rarely written down. And this particular legend of Mallanna going to Mecca was noted down by a German anthropologist named Gunther Dietz-Sontheimer in about the early 90s or so. So essentially, the story goes that Mallanna has two wives, Balija Medalamma and Golla Ketama. And in his courtship with one of these wives, and in order to be able to marry her, Mallanna had to go to Mecca to obtain a pouch of Bandaru, and Bandaru is holy turmeric. And in Kandoba, Mallanna, and Mailara traditions, turmeric is an extremely important thing, and but turmeric essentially represents gold. So Mallanna goes all the way to Mecca, and the legend goes that the inhabitants of Mecca are all Shiva Bhaktas, and they wear sacred ash, and they wear Rudraksha beads around their arms and their legs. And Mallanna goes and he spends 12 years in Mecca, and throughout this period, he kind of employs himself. He acts as a servant, and he causes the populace of Mecca to begin eating meat. Interestingly enough, and also makes them drink alcohol. Start drinking alcohol. Now, suddenly, there's a well in Mecca, and possibly, who knows, this could allude to the famous Zamzam well. And the well goes dry, and the inhabitants of Mecca are obviously concerned, and they ask Mallanna if he could help them, and he does. So what he does is he orders them to sacrifice a black cow, and using the meat of the black cow, they make something called kanduru. He makes them, which is like a biryani-like dish, essentially, and he makes the inhabitants of Mecca smoke ganja, and then he tells them to look into the well, and suddenly they see water beginning to trickle back into the well. Now, this is sort of towards the start of his time in Mecca, and eventually, at the end of the 12 years, the well is completely filled up, and Mallanna decides that it's time to go. And as the well has kind of filled up at this point, Bandaru, which is the holy turmeric, starts spurting out from besides the well. So Mallanna collects the Bandaru he needs to get married to his fiancée, and he tries to escape Mecca, but the inhabitants of Mecca have grown really fond of him by now, and so what they do is they try holding him back. So Mallanna kind of puts them into a deep slumber, and he quickly escapes. The inhabitants of Mecca wake up, and they chase Mallanna all the way back to Telangana. And so the story goes that Mallanna dives into a river called the Ganga. Now, the term Ganga in this sense would generally refer to any mighty river, and in the case of Telangana, it would refer to the Godavari River. And, well, the inhabitants of Mecca can't find him, so they go back home disappointed. And Mallanna finally manages to reach his fiancée, and they end up getting married. So this is the essential story. The inhabitants of Mecca are said to call Mallanna Malkan, and even his equivalent in Maharashtra, Kandoba, is also often called Malu Khan or Malu as such. So, and Kandoba is sometimes dressed in paraphernalia that's generally identified as being Islamic, as in like Muslim courtly dress, etc. So that's a very interesting legend of Mallanna somehow ending up in Mecca.
That's really fascinating. There's so much really to unpack here. There's one element of continuity that certainly remained is that this gentleman from Telangana, like us today, continues to have a fondness for biryani and for a little bit of alcohol along with it. That's weirdly endearing in a way. This is also fascinating to me because I actually got into this whole kind of Mallanna kind of wormhole over the last couple of days, and I dug up the chapter by Sontheimer, and I also watched a couple of videos of Mallanna Kathalu or Mallanna stories on YouTube, which are basically these modern productions by Mallanna devotees. And this version of him going to to Mecca is slightly different in the sense that the Meccans are dressed in very obviously, if I dare say, stereotypically Muslim costume, or at least the way that Muslims are present in India in popular media today, rather than being Shiva Bhaktas as they seem to have been described in this somewhat older legend that Sondheim has recorded. And there's, I don't know if this is something that has originated in the oral tradition more recently, but there's one courtier in Mecca who tries to mess with him, but the ruler of Mecca is like super chill and wants to help out Mallanna, and Mallanna stays there for a while and actually relates the story to the king of why he's called Malkoji, because apparently his mother prayed to a Sufi saint and also to Shiva before he was born, and as a result gave him both names. So it's very interesting to kind of see that very clearly Mallanna's stories kind of represent an almost collaborative storytelling, if I can use that term, between Muslim communities and pre-existing worshippers of Mallanna. So that's really fascinating to me, and the fact that Mecca is seen as the source of gold, that people in Mecca are seen as Shiva Bhaktas, that they develop this deep love for Mallanna, and that Mallanna, of course, is depicted with doing things that again are not very often associated with the quote-unquote great tradition, right? This idea of consuming alcohol, dishes of rice and meat, and particularly a god actually preparing those. It's quite surprising. It's not really what you would expect to hear. But what do you think all this means, Vivek? What do you think are the origins of this kind of syncretic story? You've already touched upon a little bit of that, I think, with the whole idea that Khandoba is dressed in Muslim courtly costume. But so is it reasonable to assume that this is a result of the Deccan Sultanates and their interaction with local communities in the upland Deccan?
I think, well, partly from a political angle, yes, the influence of the Deccan Sultanates and their successors, but also the migration of Muslim communities as well as the conversion of local communities into Islam sort of created the need to accommodate these communities. And that sort of brings me in a way to our next little bit, but in terms of how various local communities end up being accommodated through legends of the deities. So, like I mentioned earlier, Mallanna has two wives, Balija Medalamma and Golla Ketama. And Balija Medalamma means Medalamma from the Balija community, and the Balijas are the Lingayat Vani caste, i.e. they're a merchant community, while the Gollas are the Yadava Gollas, who consider Mallanna their Kuladeva and deity. And essentially, through marriage, Mallanna becomes a symbol of how the various village communities are united, essentially. And hence there has already been a tradition, not just with regards to Mallanna, but various deities across the south, wherein through marriage or through the establishment of relationships of some sort, communities are united within the symbol that is the local deity. And so it becomes quite natural for when the Islamic presence in the Deccan rises, both in terms of a political presence as well as the changing social demographics of the North Deccan. There comes a need to include Muslim populations who do play very important roles within the community, within local mythologies, and to unify them with the local deity as well in some way. So in this case, Mallanna goes to Mecca. Mallanna, in fact, I forgot to mention that he dresses as a fakir. So it's not that he is obviously a non-Islamic person, but a non-Muslim, but he dresses as a fakir. He takes up the role of a Muslim fakir. So it goes to the extent to that enables complete inclusion of dietary habits, complete inclusion of aspects of dress into local traditions and local practices.
That's absolutely fascinating. One thing that I'm particularly interested in is this idea of marriage and the gods' marriages being used as a way to kind of represent the integration of local communities, right? The first example that popped into my mind is actually this example of Meenakshi, the goddess of Madurai, who was supposed to have originally been born as this kind of, a young girl with multiple appendages who was basically destined to become Shiva's wife. And of course, the tutelary deity of Vijayanagara itself, Pampa Devi, who was supposed to have been a local girl who performed asceticisms until Shiva Virupaksha showed up and married her. So it's kind of interesting to see a very similar dynamic being used at a local level as well to kind of integrate a different community. So clearly there's not something that's unique to the quote-unquote great tradition. It's something that communities all across the Indian subcontinent have, and at least through southern India, have tried to use as a kind of metaphor to represent this coming together of different communities who are worshipping the same deity. That's really fascinating, Vivek. Now, are there more examples of this kind of thing happening, though? So you mentioned Khandoba a little earlier, the Maharashtrian equivalent, as it were, of Mallanna, who also wears a Muslim courtly costume. So are there examples of Khandoba, for example, marrying women from communities other than the Gorlas, for example?
Well, in relation to Khandoba, it would be castes and communities that are quite specific to Maharashtra. And in this case, Khandoba's two main wives are Malsa and Banai. And Malsa comes from, again, is a Lingayat. She comes from the Lingayat Vani caste, the merchant caste. And Banai comes from the Dangar community. And the Dangars are a pretty interesting community because, like the Gollas and the Kurmas, they too are a pastoralist community. And a lot of scholars believe that Khandoba essentially originated as a Dangar deity and was eventually worshipped by other communities as well. And Dangars do have their own myths and legends in relation to Khandoba, and they have their own specific practices in relation to it. So these are the two main wives of Khandoba, but Khandoba goes on to marry several other wives, including a Muslim woman named, one of her names is Chandai Bhagwani. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. But he also marries a woman from the gardener caste. He marries a tailor woman. He marries a woman from the oil presser caste. So, like I said earlier, within Khandoba, the village is unified in a way. Again, there is a sort of, we need to be real and acknowledge the fact that casteism has meant that these communities will have a lot of internal divisions and will practice things like untouchability. The Dangars particularly have been on the receiving end of casteism quite a lot. But symbolically within the deity, there is a space to unite the village as a whole. And in that sense, it also sort of facilitates a narrative that shows that all communities are essential to the village environment and to the upkeep of the village and such. And thus they need to be united. And a religious sort of mechanism of doing so sort of becomes the best way to do so in a way.
So what is really fascinating to me, Vivek, about this whole description, this whole idea that the deity essentially becomes a space where the different communities that live in a village kind of reinforce their social relations, as it were, is that very often it's thought of as a process that's almost imposed from the top down. This idea that the greater tradition comes in and assimilates lesser traditions, but very obviously, when you're talking about communities like the Dhangars, for example, when you're talking about communities of artisans, tailors, these are not people who necessarily would have been schooled in very complex ritual practices and metaphysics and whatnot. It seems like a much more of a bottom up, almost like a grassroots kind of swelling, this kind of coming together. And the term that you use, that the deity becomes a space for the village to kind of interact, is really interesting. And it's interesting to also think about the sheer scale of the kind of interactions that are needed for these kind of communities to be represented in a much more important urban god, for example, a god who people make pilgrimages to from all across the subcontinent, who is in charge of one of the wealthiest temples in southern India, specifically the Ranganatha Swami temple. I believe that is an interesting example of this kind of structuring of social relations through this legend of a marriage happening from Srirangam as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So one of the lesser known consorts of Sri Ranganatha Swami at Sri Rangam is a goddess named Tulukanachiyar. Tulukanachiyar literally means Tughlaq princess, and the term Tulaka has been used quite a lot in parts of Tamil Nadu and Malayalam and Kerala, to still refer to Muslim communities in general. So there are variations of the legend. One variation goes, essentially the common theme is that this takes place during the invasions of the Delhi Sultanate into southern India, and with instances of the plundering of very sacred sites. And Sri Rangam was targeted, I think, about twice or thrice over a couple of centuries. And this is during one such incursion. According to one version of the legend, it's Malik Kafur himself who invades Sri Rangam. Again, there is another version, and because the term Tughlaq is used, it would probably mean that the events of the legend took place at a later time. There's a lot of, it's a bit uncertain. We're a bit uncertain about that. But essentially, the general who invades Sri Rangam ransacks it, and before he could do so, the temple priests managed to hide the main deity, the main idol of Ranganatha, but they are unable to hide the Utsavar, which is the processional idol of the deity. And the general, after ransacking Sri Rangam, takes the Utsavar all the way to Delhi. And a local Tamil woman is said to have followed the army all the way to Delhi and found out where the Utsavar finally ended up, and it ended up at the house of the general. And she goes back to Sri Rangam and she informs the priests, and a group of priests, some say musicians, but essentially an entertainment troupe, makes their way all the way to Delhi. And they approach the Sultan, and they manage to get an audience with the Sultan, and they perform for him. And everyone is delighted by their performance, and including the general who ransacks Sri Rangam. And he asks the entertainment troupe, what would you like as a reward? And they ask for the Utsavar. Now, in the meanwhile, the daughter of the general, some traditions name her as Suradini. She finds the Utsavar and she grows very fond of it to the extent that she essentially falls in love with the idol, falls in love with Ranganatha. And the general grants the entertainment troupe their request, and they take the idol away from Suradini. But they are aware of the fact that Suradini is very attached to it. So before the general could change his mind, they leave at the dead of night. They leave Delhi at the dead of night. And Suradini is desperate to get the idol back. So she beseeches her father to get it back for her. And he sends troops after the troop of entertainers. They, in the meanwhile, split into smaller groups, and one group who have the Utsavar with them, they end up at Tirupati. Suradini makes her way all the way to Sri Rangam, and when she finds that the Utsavar is not there, she collapses and dies in the angst of separation. Eventually, the Utsavar ends up coming back to Sri Rangam, and Sri Ranganatha appears in the dream of the Bhattar, the head priest, and he orders him to establish a shrine for Suradini, where she'd be named as Tulukanachiyar, and she would be worshipped as his consort, because Suradini, when she gave up her soul, gave up her life, her soul merged with Ranganatha. And so to this day, there is actually a painting. If you go to Sri Rangam, there is a painting that represents Suradini, and it's offered chapatis as naivedyam or food offerings, because chapatis are apparently Muslim food. So there is a parallel legend actually. So in the town of Mallanna in Karnataka, there is a temple called Tirunarayanam, and it has a similar legend, except for the fact that it happened at a different time period, and the person who gets the idol back is the famous Sri Vaishnava philosopher Ramanujacharya. So it kind of happened, the events sort of unfold in a similar way. Suradini, or whatever her name is in that particular legend, there isn't really a name given to her. She ends up at Mallanna and she dies. She gives up her life essentially. And she is still worshipped there in the form of an idol. And she is actually veiled. So she's in Parda as an elite Muslim woman is imagined to be. So these traditions are particularly interesting because these are very rare instances of syncretic legends within more orthodox spaces, more orthodox Hindu spaces. Because the legends of Mallanna, the legends of Kandoba, we need to remember that Mallanna and Kandoba are primarily gods that emerge from Dalit and Bahujan communities. So that the devotees are primarily Dalit and Bahujan. In Kandoba's case, there are Brahmin worshippers, and there are Brahmin families who do have Kandoba as their Kuladaiva, their family deity. But especially in Telangana and Karnataka, gods like Mallanna, local deities like Mallanna, are emerge from Dalit Bahujan belief systems, and there is a tendency of there being greater ease to accommodate various communities and such. And like you said, Anirudh, there is a perception that it usually happens from this sort of accommodation happens top to bottom. And true, that is the case, but it also happens from, bottom to top. But we do have to acknowledge the fact that these top to bottom cases are still quite prevalent. And this is a bit of a side note, but I think it is important to bring up that a lot of these legends we are discussing are in relation to local belief systems and the arrival of Islam and Christianity. But there is a tradition of religious syncretism, and so these legends are a part of a more positive tradition of religious syncretism. But when you did mention the top to bottom approach, there is a history in South India of religious syncretic legends emerging that do sort of assimilate indigenous belief systems, indigenous deities, and particularly Adivasi deities and sacred spaces, that in a way that kind of ends up being appropriation and almost near exclusion of the communities, the original communities themselves. So we kind of have to acknowledge both sides to it. When I mean both sides, I mean the possibilities of there being both a top-to-bottom process of religious syncretic legends emerging, as well as a bottom-to-top approach. However, a bottom-to-top approach tends to often be less problematic to us if you look at it from an anthropological lens.
Kind of assimilation or syncretism tend to be a little less exclusionary than the other way around. If I think that's roughly what you're getting at, right?
Yeah.
It really is very interesting to me, especially if we can actually come back to Mallanna for a little bit, because Mallanna is actually worshipped in a rather different form as Mallikarjuna in Srisailam. And in the form of Mallikarjuna, he is functionally indistinguishable from Shiva, right? To the point where the Veerashaiva Bhakti movement of the 13th, 14th century, especially the poetess Akka Mahadevi, would describe Shiva as Chenna Mallikarjuna. And that is especially interesting to me because the Veerashaiva movement was very anti-caste, very anti that kind of social hierarchy, and very pro these ideas of personal devotion to these deities. And I've been reading a little bit about these local deities, and it seems that this idea of this personal bond between the devotee and the god, and therefore this merging in a way between the devotee and the god, and there's this form of relationship as almost a form of service, which in return brings forth grace from the deity, is something that seems to be a common theme, right? And that's actually especially clear in the story of Tulaka Nachiyar, this whole idea that Ranganatha is moved by her devotion and she merges with him upon her death and is therefore worshipped after that. It's certainly interesting to think about what kind of political top-down dynamics led to that kind of interaction happening. I mean, very obviously, I think there's good room to doubt that the Tulaka Nachiyar was an actual Tughlaq princess. But perhaps it points to some form of major interaction between Muslim polities and the temple of Sri Rangam. It could very well have been the Madurai Sultanate, despite the bad rep that it generally gets in modern discourse. Or it could also be a much later kind of legend that came in perhaps during the Nayaka period, because the Nayaka kingdoms very often had fairly amicable relationships with the Deccan sultanates that dominated the upland. But coming back to this whole idea of this kind of relationship between the god and other deities, and this we talked about marriage a little earlier, but as I kind of alluded to, there's also examples of different kinds of service that through the performing of which various other new deities become agglomerated to an existing tradition. And there's a whole bunch of examples of this across southern India, especially. I believe there's an example of Vavara Swami, the Muslim companion of Ayyappa, and there's also an interesting example of a Muslim guardian of the famous queen from the Mahabharata, Draupadi, the wife of the 5 Pandava brothers. Can you tell us a little bit more about these two traditions, Vivek?
So in the tradition in the mythology revolving around the god Ayyappa, the hill god Ayyappa in Kerala, there is a Muslim companion to Ayyappa named Vavar or Vavara Swami. Vavar could be a rendering of Babar. And in some variations, Vavar is a Muslim missionary who comes to Kerala from Arabia to spread Islam. In another version, he is a pirate who raids the Malabar coast until he encounters Ayyappa. And the two of them have a small battle. And Ayyappa finally triumphs over Babar. And at the end of it, Babar and Ayyappa become friends. And eventually, Ayyappa's main reason for incarnating is to defeat a demoness named Mahishi. And Babar is said to have helped Ayyappa in his battle. So to date, devotees who go to Sabrimala and who make the pilgrimage in December and January are meant to stop at a mosque at a place called Erumeli, about 50 kilometers away from Sabrimala. And this mosque is known as the Vavar Mosque, or the Vavara Swami Mosque. And they don't enter the prayer hall. They don't enter the prayer hall of the mosque, but they perform a ritual dance outside that depicts the battle between Ayyappa and Mahishi. And by doing so, they essentially pay their respects to Vavar. And only when they do so, they are allowed to proceed on to Sabrimala, and their entire pilgrimage is considered complete. So including Vavar is an extremely important part of the famous pilgrimage to Sabrimala. In the same breath, there is also another Muslim companion across the Western Ghats in the Tamil lands in northern Tamil Nadu. Here, Draupadi, the famous heroine from the Mahabharata, is actually worshipped as a local goddess. She's worshipped more often as a lineage goddess, quite similar to a lot of Amman deities, which are village goddesses worshipped in Tamil Nadu. So she's more identified with goddesses such as Kali or Durga. And Draupadi has 2 guardians in North Tamil Nadu. These include someone called the Buffalo King or Pothuraja, as well as someone named Muttal Ravatan. Muttal Ravatan are terms that are usually used to describe Muslim traders, and they sort of allude to a history of Muslim traders coming to the south, coming to the Pandya kingdoms, etc., to trade in horses. And Muttal Ravatan, there are very disparate legends about him, but and again, most of them are nearly all of them are oral. And he is possibly supposed to have been a mantrin, a sorcerer of sorts, who could only be defeated by someone who is not born of the womb. And Draupadi is, well, according to the Mahabharata legend, emerges from fire, so she's not born from the womb. So in his Draupadi kind of brings an end to Muttal Ravatan's evil doings by defeating him, and she enables him to become her devotee and her guardian. Of course, one legend goes that he is meant to give up eating meat and give up his religion, but at the same breath, it says that Draupadi Amman will extend her patronage and her protection to Muslim communities as well. So if you go to Draupadi shrines, you will find a statue of Pothuraja and a figure, usually a stone, of representing Muttal Ravatan, usually in the north. And though he is supposed to be vegetarian in many of these shrines, he is kind of offered meat and offerings of alcohol, sometimes ganja and beedis, etc. But he essentially acts as protector of the goddess and the protector of the sacred, her sacred space.
This is okay. Both of these are such interesting stories, right? And there's so many different meanings that seem to be layered within these stories. Both of them have this common idea of Muslims kind of being, of Muslim deities kind of being tamed, as it were, through battle with a local deity, and then taking on a much more benevolent role, and then there being a kind of contract, as it were, a kind of promise that the deity themselves makes that incorporates these Muslim deities into their own practice and gives Muslim communities a space in their worship. And I mean, the obvious and perhaps the most banal way to interpret this is that there was initially violent contact, and then these two communities are learning to get by, and they're doing something similar to what Khandoba is doing, right? We're creating this kind of shared space where all the communities of a village might come together. But these are actually much bigger deities. The cult of Ayappa, the worship of Draupadi seem to be at a fairly large scale. They're associated with major gods, Ayappa with Shiva and Vishnu, Draupadi with the Pandavas, and through them to Vishnu. And it is really interesting to kind of see that Muslims are kind of given this space within their mythologies, within their temples, within their rituals. But what do you think really led to this kind of thing emerging? Because what is most striking to me is that even though in southern India, especially along the Tamil Nadu and Kerala coast, Muslims came peacefully. We know from a vast number of overwhelming amount of primary evidence, really, that Muslims came to southern India's shores relatively soon after the establishment of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. We know that they participated quite extensively in a very syncretic kind of practice. If you look at mosques in Kerala or Tamil Nadu, for example, if not for the fact that there are no humans represented, the architecture is strikingly similar to what you have seen in contemporary temples. And we also know that guilds of people of West Asian descent, of Muslims, Jews, Parsis, usually with a considerable kind of indigenous Indian descent as well, were engaged quite extensively in the Indian Ocean trade, were respected by kings and rulers, and were really sought after. Really, their guilds were given considerable trade concessions. So, why is it that despite this peaceful contact, why do you think that this idea of violence and taming and then incorporation and then peaceful relations, why do you think that the stories evolved that way, Vivek?
I think there are two ways of looking at it. The first would be that it kind of provides a more realistic picture of how communal relations would have been. I think that is a danger with looking at syncretic stories, is to romanticize a past wherein, well, everything was perfect between religious communities, and it isn't always the case. Even in Kerala, which has a place where it has had such an ancient presence of Christians and Muslims, there are legends that allude to a sort of ambivalence between Hindu deities and Christian and Muslim figures, such as Vava, Swami, and to that extent in Tamil Nadu as well with Muttal Ravatan. So I think these legends sort of provide us with a more comprehensive picture about how communal relations play out. They are for the most part peaceful. You have processes of accommodation that include various religious communities within a single space, and in some cases a single deity. But at the same time, there is bound to be tensions, and these aren't really tensions in terms of, matters of religion as such. It's more tensions like there would be tensions between caste communities, tensions in terms of resources, in terms of land, in terms of access to water, access to other materials, in terms of trade. So there are bound to be various tensions between religious and caste communities that will reflect in their legends. So in that sense, you do have a very positive sort of relationship in many ways between these religions presented in these syncretic legends. But at the same time, I think they can be they are metaphorical for a more realistic relationship as well. Not everything is perfect, and it's not all sunshine and roses. Another way of looking at it could possibly be the impact of the idea of ritual purity that is brought about by caste. And this tends to be seen how, for example, when I talked about Muttal Ravatan, how he is forced to give up meat, and he is not meant to practice religion anymore. And we have to be aware of the fact that within Orthodox Hindu circles, as well as and with the caste system trickling down as well, Muslims were, and Christians to a certain extent, were still considered outsiders. The whole term lecha, for example. And so accommodation can at times be at the display a sort of power imbalance between the local deity, who, especially if they have more Orthodox Hindu connections, such as Draupadi does, and Ayapad now does, as well as the non-local non-local religious figure. So in that sense, we see it a lot less in relation to deities such as Kandova and Mallanna. But Tulukanachya, though she is a Muslim princess, she is still served only vegetarian food. Sri Rangam, of course, after all, is an Orthodox Hindu temple. So we need to be aware of the fact that there are a lot of caste dynamics to this as well. And they do kind of display themselves in a lot of legends. And again, these legends aren't, there isn't a singular tradition as such. So there are multiple versions of these legends. So different castes, different communities will have different versions of these legends. So again, what I kind of narrated were specific versions. There are, of course, bound to be counter versions as such. And there are still counter versions emerging, considering how the religious landscape keeps evolving. But yeah, these are two possible understandings of, the variety in which relationships sort of play out within these legends.
Okay, wow, this is all absolutely fascinating, and there's really so much to unpack here. Even though we're kind of running a little low on time at this point, Vivek. There's this idea that dynamics between communities, whether they're caste communities or religious communities in India, are complex. It seems like that's something that should be taken for granted. It seems like that's something that should be obvious, right? But in the kind of discourse that we have about religions and caste interactions today, that isn't very often brought up. Either they're seen as something that's been unilaterally rosy and wonderful, or unilaterally absolutely horrific and conflicting over many, many centuries across a vast landmass, which is about the size of Western Europe, if not even larger. And I think the stories that you've brought up so far and the kind of dynamics that you've highlighted really, really emphasize this. There isn't really a single rule when it comes to kind of interpreting these local legends. It makes a lot more sense to kind of try and be as objective and not try to project our own understandings of how we think history has been onto them. Because very often the ambiguities within these legends and the fact that they're constantly being made and remade serve, as it were, as a kind of finger on the pulse of the evolution of Indian religions. And that is so endlessly fascinating to me, is that when we talk about Indian religions or Indian culture, or when you say that Indian culture is fundamentally this, very often the examples that are provided are from the quote-unquote greater tradition. But really what has really come out to me in this entire conversation most strongly is that the lesser tradition is very often far, far more representative of the way that India has been and continues to be than anything else. But before we wrap up for today, I'd like to ask you for any final thoughts or final examples that you might want to share with our listeners.
So, as you said, Anirudh, these dynamics sort of play out even interestingly within Christian traditions too in Kerala. And again, these legends are often just relayed as anecdotes at this point of time. But there is a tradition that many temples and churches, the deities of many Hindu temples, have siblings in Christian saints. And these relationships sort of, again, as you said, displayed a very complex sort of relationships that religious interaction sort of brings about. One of my favorite examples comes from a town called Manarkad in the Kottayam district, which has a very famous church to the Virgin Mary. And it also has a temple to the goddess Kannagi, who of Silapatikaram fame. And she's worshipped as a form of mother goddess. And the Virgin Mary and Kannagi are said to be sisters, according to local legend. And during the festival, the Perunal, which is a church festival for Mary, rooster sacrifice takes place in the church, which is again a local tradition. And while the meat is given to Mary, the blood of the rooster is offered to Kannagi, to appease her. And this is because of their sibling relationship. At the same time, because they are siblings, they are bound to fight. And there is a legend that goes that the church bell at St. Mary's Church in Manarkar has a big crack in it. And that's because Kannagi got really annoyed one day by the constant tolling of the church bells. And so she damaged it. And in retaliation, Mary created a crack in the conch used during the worship of Kannagi in her temple. So we see these very complex relationships between religious traditions, religious dynamics. And again, like I said, and like you said too, we can't take things for face value. We can't project our particular understandings of history, particular understandings of religion, and especially how religions fall into certain categories and the boundaries of religion onto other traditions, especially if they're not our own. And there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn from these legends, and whether you believe in them or not, there's a great deal to appreciate from them, and it enables us to move forward and really think more holistically and comprehensively of the world we live in.
Wow. Thank you so much for taking us all through this magnificent journey through India's local legends, Vivek. It was an absolute pleasure having you on All Things Policy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
And thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I would like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Ciet, and PayPal. Thank you so much. You make everything possible. Before I recommend a couple of episodes, I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit about Ankush Champanerkar. Ankush was a team member who we lost due to COVID-related complications. He was a really fun guy, and I wish I knew him better than I got to know him in the short time he was with us. But I hope that you can remember him in your thoughts and prayers. Also, a quick reminder about Pod for Change, the initiative set up by the podcasting community, along with Give India, the NGO partner. You can go to tinyurl.com/podforchangeindia, and I'm sure that it would be much appreciated any donations that you could give. With that, let me quickly give you a couple of highlights from this week. Aditi Mittal was on Cyrus Says. Great episode, do check that out. On the Habit Coach, Ashton talks about using the word impossible and suggests some better alternatives. On Advertising is Dead, Varun was joined by Harsh Lal, the co-founder of the Soul Store. On This Round is on Me, Gauri talks to Pankit Desai, who is the co-founder and CEO of Secure Tech. And finally, I'd like to mention that we have a new show called Tede Mede Raste, hosted by Keshav Chaturvedi. This time it's a trip to the beautiful blue city of Jodhpur, but every week he's going to tell you about his travels as a photographer. It's really well put together, really well done. I couldn't be more excited about the show. Please do definitely check that out. And with that, I hope we see you again next week.
Want to learn something new and have a few minutes to spare? Well, then go for the Traveling Professor's Diary, where I, Siddharth Deshmukh, the Traveling Professor, will help you glean from all the insights that I've gained from wherever I've traveled, learned, taught, and repeated. Join me every Tuesday and Thursday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you